watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining me here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on Bart Ehrman's view of the resurrection of Jesus, or really how the belief of Jesus' resurrection came to be. That's the topic we're exploring on today's episode as we pick back up with a book study that I started last autumn, maybe late summer. I'd have to look at the dates. We've been slowly working through Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, and we are commencing on chapter 5, and I have a lot of material that I want to run through of just a sliver of this chapter, so it's likely going to turn out to be the case that this will be a couple episodes deep on chapter 5. What I've appreciated about this series, and we've been off of this series, I think mid-December we've had a few different types of episodes, is that it goes deep into the subject matter. It's so often there might be, in the apologetics world, there might be interviews with apologists, philosophers, New Testament scholars, so on and so forth. And you get a little bit, you get tip of the iceberg stuff for sure. You might get, you dabble a little bit in the subject. The purpose of this series is to go deep into the argument that Bart Ehrman is making in his book, and we are going to be analyzing, especially today, some of the philosophical assumptions that are baked into his statements about what historians know about the facts pertaining, surrounding to the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. So, that's our topic for today. If you don't yet follow Veracity Hill on social media, here I am showing you a number of icons of social media platforms. Facebook, X, also known as Twitter, YouTube. We have a TikTok channel, and according to Mark at Defenders Media, we've got to start paying attention more at TikTok because we're getting more and more comments on there at Veracity Hill. So thank you to those commenting, and I'll be addressing some comments from YouTube later in today's episode. I have them printed out, so I will be sure to tackle those. And then also at apologetics315.com. Apologetics315.com is an apologetics web resource aggregate site. And so there are video resources there, especially links to the AP315 Interviews podcast run by Brian Otten and Chad Gross, two great ministry partners. They got a lot of great interviews at their podcast. Check out their podcast. Go to the website. You can find Veracity Hill. You can find exclusive Veracity Hill content at that website. So if you don't follow me on the socials, subscribe, like, so on and so forth, whatever the other options are. And as a buddy of mine likes me to say, smash that subscribe button on YouTube. Okay, we are talking about this book again, How Jesus Became God, the exaltation of a Jewish preacher from Galilee. And it's a New York Times bestseller. It's been out, I think, some 10 years or so now. But I thought, hey, I wanted to go deep into this subject matter because I want to study Bart Ehrman's view a little bit more. At Veracity Hill, we strive for truth. We like to clarify complex issues. That means I'm not afraid to look at non-Christian literature. Let us evaluate the arguments. We don't have to be tribalistic in apologetics. We can be bridge builders. We can be conversant. We can fairly understand the other side, and we need to fairly understand the other side before we can critique the other side. Now, we don't always have to come in with our own assumptions or conclusions about philosophical beliefs when we read non-Christian material. Sometimes statements are made, though, and especially in chapter 5, where I'm just simply right off the bat disagreeing with how things are phrased. So let me get up my web camera. You might see some messy desktop icons. I will have to get this situated as we hop once again back into reviewing the book. And here we are. Chapter 5, I might have to refocus it. You can see Chapter 5, the resurrection of Jesus, what we can know. Now, I've got a highlight here right at the bottom. Again, I'm not going to go through, this is not a sentence-by-sentence analysis. I do comment, and I might read a paragraph here and there. I might read a page, but the purpose is to give you further context, background to what I want to say, to what Bart says, I want to give you context to what he says, and that helps you understand about what I want to say. So, on the first page of chapter 5, which is in the book, page 171, Bart talks about his personal relationship with Jesus. He commonly starts off each chapter with an anecdote. I suppose that's a very good, if you're writing for a pop audience, I think that's helpful. But and he says that he's accused by Christians of never really actually having a relationship with Jesus, and so people became suspicious, when he left the faith. He writes, whether that's the case or not, it simply is not true that I never had a personal relationship with Jesus. Quite the contrary, Jesus and I were very close, and for many years. He was my daily companion, comforter, guide, and teacher, as well as my Lord and Savior. Now, I'm wondering what Bart means when he writes these words. If he is actually saying that he had a personal relationship with Jesus, then it's not the sort of thing that you simply give up. You give up believing that Jesus is not divine, is not alive and well today, relating to his followers. So Bart is using, perhaps, I think, analogical language here. And he doesn't mean this personal relationship in a sense of how we might understand other types of personal relationships. So in that case, it might be something like ambiguous language, or perhaps worse, equivocation, where we use a word one time and give it meaning, and then we use that same word another time, but it has a different meaning. That's called equivocation. Teaching you some basic Logic 101 stuff here. Now, I don't quite see him committing equivocation here, but certainly ambiguity. What do these terms mean? Those are important questions, because the way I read that, I think, no, someone who has those things doesn't give up a relationship with Jesus. If Jesus is the Lord and Savior of the universe, that's not the sort of thing that you simply give up believing in. Now, I think what Bart means to convey is something like, in his mind, he believed he was relating to Jesus. In his mind, he was seeking the words of Jesus to give him comfort. That is something slightly different when we think of models of relating to Jesus. Now, this is all interesting to me because I enjoy thinking about what's called the problem of religious language. This is something philosophers write books on, give papers on at conferences, write papers for academic journals. The problem of religious language. Now, I don't have time today to go into it, go into the various models and different camps and so on and so forth, but suffice it to say, it's a topic that's of interest to me, and I enjoy thinking about when Christians talk about this language of a personal relationship, what do they mean? And I think the way Bart's describing this here is maybe the way many Christians also mean it. And so he's just trying to say, hey, I was like you. The trouble I have is that for someone like myself, I am skeptical of the way many evangelical Christians talk about the way that they relate to Jesus. And so for me, I don't buy Bart or many evangelical Christians' lingo of how they relate to King Jesus. I think I don't understand it fully. And I think I know what people mean, but I don't find myself agreeing, at least in the semantic usage of certain terms. So I thought that was interesting because that's how Bart starts off this chapter. Now, at the bottom of 172, he starts talking about Christian apologists. So, of course, my ears are perked up. I do consider myself a Christian apologist. Dan McClellan, who I've been engaging with some videos recently, in December, I did a couple, I think. He is quick to attack apologists and apologetics, and that is dogma over the data. I want to be clear here that apologetics, classically speaking, is a defense. And what Dan McClellan and what Bart Ehrman and what other people do to make a case for their beliefs is also apologetics. Okay? They are defending their own beliefs, which is perfectly fair and normal. I am not putting down non-Christian apologetics for the fact that it is apologetics. I want to critique this pejorative use against apologists and against this term apologetics. It is a classical historical term, and there is really no reason why it should be used in the pejorative sense. Dan McClellan commonly uses it pejoratively. Bart Ehrman uses it pejoratively here. So let's see how he uses it in a pejorative sense. He writes, bottom of 172, but Christian apologists do, and when I was one of them, I did as well. So he's talking about this objectivity, the pursuit of objectivity. That is why Christian apologists are so keen to prove that the resurrection happened. This is a standard weapon in the apologetic arsenal. It's a standard weapon. Let me get that mouse out of the way. You can look at all the evidence for the resurrection objectively and conclude on the basis of overwhelming proof that God really did raise Jesus from the dead. No other explanation can account for the objectively established historical data. For example, that Jesus' tomb was empty and that his disciples claimed to see him afterward. And so apologists proceed by taking these two data as facts and showing that no other explanation is plausible. That the disciples stole the body, that they went to the wrong tomb, that they were hallucinating, and so on. He continues, if one wants to play the objectivity game, it is a game. There is nothing objectively that makes objectivity objectively true. It is relatively easy to poke holes in this apologetic ploy, a ploy that I myself used for years when I was a Christian trying to convert people to believe in the resurrection. Let me pause here. You're going to see orange highlights. I have some PowerPoints that I want to look at later on. Let's first go through this section, the introduction and the beliefs of the disciples. Then I'll come back to my PowerPoint. Page 173 here arguably has the most baked-in philosophical statements that are not explicit, but we are going to deal with each of these orange highlights in the slides that are forthcoming. But let's first just work through it. So I will read this whole page because I want you to have a grasp of where he's coming from before I present reasons for why that is. Let's see here. For one thing, Bart continues, as I've already argued, there are very serious reasons to doubt that Jesus was buried decently and that his tomb was discovered to be empty. Moreover, as I've argued, any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred, since the miracle defies all probability, or else we wouldn't call it a miracle. But apart from whether it makes sense to wrangle over the objectively best explanation for the data, notice he puts objectively in quotation marks. This is a historian questioning objectivity. All right, I'll save my criticisms for later. There is the bigger problem, namely that faith is a miracle, that faith in a miracle is a matter of faith, not of objectively established knowledge. That is why some historians believe that Jesus was raised and other equally good historians do not believe he was. Both sets of historians have the same historical data available to them, but it's not the historical data that makes a person a believer. Faith is not historical knowledge, and historical knowledge is not faith. I would love to ask Bart what he means by faith here. What does he mean by faith? How is he using it? I think he's using it in this pop-level sense that faith is belief without evidence. Faith is belief contrary or without regard to evidence. And that's to say nothing about the concept of belief as, say, trust. So I'm very much disagree with him on how he's using this term faith here. But more on these orange highlights later. Let's it's just a few more pages that I think I want to run through, a few more comments, then we'll get into the PowerPoint. So then on the 174, so that was sort of the introductory section. Then there's another section here, the belief of the disciples. And Bart is going to explain, in some ways, some great ideas here. For example, and here's where you get my color-coded system. One matter that he wants to think about is, when was it precisely that belief in Jesus' resurrection and exaltation began? When was that first belief? That is a very good question to ask and to pursue. Now, one of the problems I have is just a couple lines later, and I'm trying to remember if I do have a PowerPoint slide on this, but I'll read this. Bart writes that he's concerned that this time frame is much later, that it's not simply 3 days later that the disciples came to believe this. He previously argued that from 1 Corinthians 15, that Jesus rising 3 days later, that 3 days is simply theologically significant, not historically significant. And then he says, moreover, middle of 175, moreover, if it is true that the disciples fled from Jerusalem to Galilee when Jesus was arrested, and that it was there that some of them saw him, they could not have seen him on the first Sunday morning after his death. If they fled on Friday, they would not have been able to travel on Saturday, the Sabbath, and since it was about 120 miles from Jerusalem to Capernaum, their former home base, it would have taken a week at least for them to go there on foot. He continues on. And there's a footnote there, not because Bart has run some analysis. The end note, actually, not a footnote. The end note is sort of humorous because he simply cites a private conversation that he had with one of his colleagues. You don't believe me? Oh, okay. Well, let's go. Let's follow. This is end note number 1 of chapter 5. Let's check this out. So to give grounding to his claim about this, you can see, footnotes and endnotes are kind of used as support. Here we go. And you might even see, I'm just noticing my fingernails are dirty. And my hands are dirty because I've been working on the studio here at Defenders Media. So yeah, there's going to be some dirt in there if anybody notices. And now that I've brought attention to it, you probably... Okay, so here it is. Here's end note number 1, chapter 5. My thanks to Eric Myers, Bart writes, scholar of ancient Judaism and archaeologist of Palestine, from crosstown rival Duke, for providing this information in a private correspondence. So not a work colleague, but a fellow peer in the field, we'll say. Private correspondence, that's his grounding to the claim. So I started running an analysis, and I disagree with him on this. It's actually roughly 100 miles on foot from Jerusalem to Capernaum. It takes 37 hours to walk. So yes, it takes a few days. It would not take a week. I think that's an exaggeration. When you think about how much a person could walk in a day, certainly horseback, it's a whole different game changer. But there's another issue that I'll raise with my PowerPoints here shortly, since we will come back to this page 175. Okay, and then he goes on to talk about the types of body. All right, there's 3 subsections about this, the raising of a spiritual body. It was nice to see, in green, using my color coding, 177, it was nice to see that for Bart, he is happy to grant that Paul believed in a physical bodily resurrection, not merely a spiritual body, but a body, yes, a material body, yes, a body intimately connected to the body that died and was buried, yes, but a transformed body. So for Paul, it was a spiritual type of body. It was a spiritually resurrected body. It was a slightly different body than simply what was there before. But for Bart, it's clearly the case for Paul that it's a physical body. And so that's great, because there are other New Testament scholars that want to dispute that that was the case of Paul. Then he goes on to describe the Gnostics regarding a merely spiritual body. And then just 2 more things, maybe 3 or 4, let's see here. Going to top of 181. Bart writes, if my reconstruction of the events in Corinth stated above are correct, then already in the 50s, some believers in Jesus would have been open to the view that Jesus' spirit, not his physical body, was raised from the dead. Okay? Yes, that is the case, that there were some early Christians that believed that. However, the whole point is that Paul is telling them that they're mistaken and that they are wrong. So the fact that there were some early Christians that did believe that does not give ground to any sort of case like that. And Bart sort of wants to imply that. It's a subtle messaging here from Bart that it seems that this is a available option. All right, he talks about that there was commonality between Paul and Luke. Okay, and then last comment I'll make before we get to my PowerPoint is 183, this idea of the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. This was the view that ultimately became the dominant one throughout Christianity in later periods. I've read Bart's book, Lost Christianities, and this sort of approach, it's like a sociological analysis of theological arguments. What became the dominant one, this and that. It's almost like saying, well, this is a power play, and it was politics that ultimately resulted in so on and so forth. What Bart in Lost Christianities doesn't argue is that as a historian, we want to look at what was the earliest belief. And the earliest beliefs were, in fact, the bodily resurrection. So if you want to go back to what the earliest Christians believed, that was it. And so the reason why these later views were deemed incorrect, inaccurate, or even, later on, heretical, is not because one was dominant and the other was a minority position, but rather because they were novelties. Bart doesn't make that case, and historically, we would want to make that case. We want to be good historians, so we want to recognize what was it that the early Christians believed, because earlier is generally better. Okay, now, I don't have time to get into the visions of Jesus. We'll look at that next week, because I have things I want to say about this page, 173. There's so much philosophical baggage baked into this page. So let me get over to my PowerPoint, and we will run through that. Gabe, let me know if we're good with the PowerPoint. Okay. All right, and I don't know what animations I have here, so we'll see what pops up. And we'll see in what order it pops up. Bart writes, there is nothing objectively that makes objectivity objectively true. Let's read that again. Philosophical concepts, the longer you think about them, the more your brain hurts. There is nothing objectively that makes objectivity objectively true. Well, here's a problem. That is a self-defeating statement. But also, yes, there is, and it's called reality. All right, what do I mean? First, this is a self-defeating statement by Bart. There we go, page 173. It's self-defeating because Bart believes that there is this sense of objectivity and that we can even make objective statements about the objective world. And this is one such statement. There is nothing objectively that makes objectivity objectively true. That is an objective statement about objectivity. And then next I say, my second point, yes, there is reality. Reality itself, the existence of the external world, the world around us that is outside our minds, is evidence that there is something objective that makes the objective world true. I hold to what's called common sense realism. Thomas Reid was a philosopher, Scottish philosopher, who wrote and responded to David Hume. And this common sense approach is simply that what we perceive, so philosophers, they deal with questions like relationship of the mind to the world. And so Thomas Reid simply argued for what later became called common sense realism, that what we perceive is true of the world, that those things actually are there, that there are books on my shelves here. Those books are actually there in the external world. I can see them, I can touch them. It's a very, yes, it's simplistic theory. I think it's a better theory compared to some of the other theories of how things exist and how we can know those things exist. So I take it that the external world is evidence that there is something objectively that makes objectivity objectively true. So I disagree with Bart's philosophical statement there. Let's look at another statement that he makes on page 173. He writes, "It is relatively easy to poke holes in this apologetic ploy. There are various serious reasons to doubt that Jesus was buried." So he is sort of mocking apologists and apologetics here. He calls it a game. 173, he says, if one wants to play the objectivity game, it is a game. There's nothing right? He plays this very game that he scolds. He's playing the game. He says, hey, there's reasons X, Y, and Z to think this is the case or this is not the case, or we've got no evidence for that, so on and so forth. So he has this quote-unquote ploy himself. It's his own ploy, if you will. This is a case where the rhetoric comes in rather than, coming to the table with different interpretations of the data. Okay. He also writes regarding the resurrection. Any other scenario, the alleged resurrection of Jesus, any other scenario is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred, since the miracle defies all probability. Forgive me, I italicized the wrong word there. In my PowerPoint, I've italicized defies. In the text, the word that is italicized is the word all probability. So I'll have to change that. But I kind of like how I italicized it if I were his editor. Okay, so since the miracle defies all probability, well, I would say that this is a misunderstanding of what constitutes as a miracle. I think there are times in which miracles can be the most likely explanation of some state of affair. I also do not believe that miracles necessarily require this idea of an act running contrary to the laws of nature, which is very likely how Bart thinks of a miracle. That's not always the case. I think God can use the natural order for a miracle to occur. One common factor to miracles is the timing of the event that occurred. Secondly, and perhaps more critically, this is what Bart is describing here is nothing other than David Hume's circular reasoning. The idea here is that if you wanted to show a miracle has occurred, you need to bring evidence. Okay? So, give me evidence a miracle occurred. Someone provides evidence. You know what your response is? Their response? Oh, that's not evidence. Because there's no such thing as a miracle. If you think it's a miracle, provide evidence. Is that evidence? No, that's not evidence. Why? Because there's no such thing as a miracle. So on and so forth. You can see the circular reasoning, just top to bottom. The two propositions, it just goes in a circle. So this is circular reasoning. This is a common criticism of David Hume. And you see this right here in the way Bart has phrased this. It's the same thing. So, because, again, just look at Bart's own text. Any other scenario is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred, since the miracle defies all probability. So again, you claim a miracle occurred. Bart says, no, miracles are the least likely explanation. You need to provide evidence. You provide evidence? No, that doesn't constitute as evidence because there's some other scenario that's more likely because miracles defy all. You get the picture here. Again, this is all on page 173. All of these, that page was so baked with philosophical positions. And I say baked not as a pejorative, but because it wasn't directly, explicitly provided. Those philosophical views are built into his historical framework, into his worldview, really. So he's not dealing with those at the direct, explicit level. They're already baked into what he thinks about history and the historian. And we have reasons to disagree. We have philosophical reasons, especially on this one, to disagree with him. Let us look at the next one. The next one on 173. Faith in a miracle is a matter of faith, not of objectively established knowledge. Not of objectively established knowledge. Okay. Why think that? Why should we think that's the case? Why should we think that is true? We have faith. We generally, all humans, have faith in various established states of affairs. Now, I'd say, in established knowledge, you might think just one propositional truth or something like that. Sometimes our faith appears in a group, a collection of propositions. What do I mean? I, for example, may have faith that my wife is with our children right now. Now, is that precisely with 100% certainly true? Or do I have 100% certainty over that proposition? That's how I should phrase it. No, I don't. I don't have 100% certainty over it. For example, maybe she ran to the grocery store and someone else is watching our children right now. I trust that she's being responsible in how that all occurs. But nevertheless, I do have faith that my wife is overseeing and caring for our children at this moment. Now, we can have established knowledge about these things. We don't have to have 100% certainty. But Bart doesn't say 100% certainty. He just says established knowledge. And surely he doesn't want to smuggle in that we have to have 100% certainty in order to have established knowledge. I don't think that. I hope that's not what he's saying here. I don't think that's required. But the point here is that we can have faith, we can have trust and belief in established knowledge. So Bart is using faith here, this sense of religious faith. Now we're nuancing it. It's not just faith, it's religious faith. And this is now a different category. And I think this is a problem for Ehrman's criticism of what faith is. Let him provide in fuller detail what exactly he means by faith. As I stated earlier, I think what he means is something like belief contrary to evidence. And I don't think we have to play that game at all. Okay, we've got another statement on 173. Yes, this one's a doozy. He writes, that is why some historians believe that Jesus was raised and other equally good historians do not believe he was. Both sets of historians have the same historical data available to them, but it is not historical data that make a person a believer. Well, this begs the question of historical data, and to beg the question means, classically, one assumes the conclusion. He writes, both sets of historians have the same historical data. A according to Bart, they don't. Because Bart is already in this book. In this book, he is already disputing what constitutes as historical data. And he even changes his own mind about what he believed about that. He previously believed that the historical data included that Jesus was buried in a tomb, and in this book, he changes his mind. So how can he write? Both sets of historians have the same historical data available to them, but it is not historical data that make a person a believer. How can he write that consistently with his other beliefs? I think he's being inconsistent here. He does not actually believe that the different types of historians, Christian historians and non-Christian historians, believe in the same historical data set. That's exactly what's disputed. What constitutes the historical data set? I happen to think that it's a historical fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. That's a conclusion we come to based on historical analysis. Bart certainly doesn't think that. So it's not the case. Now, I also write here, it also wrongly assumes interpretations of the data are equal. So, again, what constitutes the historical data? All right, a couple more slides here before I get to my comments. That was 5 slides just on page 173. Now we move over to 175 because a part of Bart's argument here against belief in the resurrection, or a timely belief in the resurrection, you'll recall that he wants to determine, and this is good, he wants to determine when was it that the disciples came to believe Jesus was physically resurrected. And he makes a case, I don't think it's a good one, but he makes the case that it was not 3 days after Jesus' death. Because he writes on page 175, as I have a sneeze coming. Excuse me. Page 175, moreover, if it is true that the disciples fled Jerusalem to Galilee when Jesus was arrested, and that it was there that some of them saw him, they could not have seen him on the first Sunday morning after his death. Why? Well, because it's 120 miles away. It would take him at least a week to get there. So on and so forth. You recall just, 10, 15 minutes ago, I was running through that page, explaining that. Here's the problem with this argument. The whole point of the pursuit of determining when Jesus' disciples came to believe he was physically resurrected doesn't require an analysis of when all of the disciples came to believe this. You simply need to know when the first disciples came to believe this. As I write here on my slide, this claim by Bart, this conflates some, notice he says it was there that some of them saw him. This conflates some into all, because you don't need a later some group to form the start of the tradition. What you need is the earliest some. You need the earliest group of the disciples to form the start of this tradition. So the later group of disciples that saw him for the first time from their perspective, later on, a week or two later, is irrelevant. As long as some of the early disciples, some of the 12 saw him sooner. Well, that's when the tradition starts. So this argument about how some of the disciples saw him up in Galilee is simply irrelevant to the case. So we can dismiss that. Now, last slide here. I see I didn't even write what I wanted to write. On the type of body, I'll just talk about that before we get to Mailbag. So Bart, what I did like here, I do want to compliment Bart on his analysis of what type of body the disciples believed was resurrected. That for Bart, generally speaking, I don't agree with everything that he said in that section. Generally speaking, he's got it. that the earliest disciples believed Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead. Not merely spiritually, not existentially in our hearts he's risen, but that for them it was a materialistic bodily resurrection. So I want to applaud Bart. That I think that's an accurate take of how to interpret the New Testament documents. Again, there are some New Testament scholars that don't think that, but Bart has it right there. So we're going to find, in general, agreement on that. He tries to pit he tries to pit Luke against Paul, what Luke may have been trying to do. How about what Luke may not have been trying to do? For those that are reading, you'll know what I'm talking about, reading along with me. So, okay, that is my analysis of the start of chapter 5. Next week, I'll get into Bart's analysis and case for this idea of visions, and we will take a look at that. So we will close up our shop on the book analysis, and I have printed some comments from commenters on YouTube and Facebook that I want to deal with and respond to. Since, I'll be honest, I don't do the best job doing this, so I'm hoping I can maybe make this a regular pattern. So thank you to all that are commenting on YouTube or Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or all those social media platforms. So, I've got the slide here. We're going to call this Mailbag, Online Comments, and Maybe Haters. I hope you enjoy how I formatted that PowerPoint. And maybe haters. I do get some hate comments. I am personally not offended by people that spew hate online. I think it's rough. I don't like seeing it for other people, like my friends or ministry partners or other folks in apologetics, brothers and sisters in Christ. So that can be annoying. But I personally have extremely thick skin. So just know that the God of the universe will judge you for what you say online. And that is one reason why I have a policy. Before I get to the comments, my policy has generally been, it's been my policy for a very long time now. In fact, I remember doing a lecture at an apologetics conference on how to engage online. That was one of the first conferences I spoke at. Never write anything online you wouldn't say to someone's face. If I had to give you a piece of advice, never write anything online that you wouldn't say to someone's face. And that's a way you can safeguard your character, also prevent being judged by the Creator God of the universe, because God knows these things. And, look, if you're angry at someone, if you're passionate, that's fine. There have been times I have emailed, I know I've shared this story before. There's someone I emailed and wrote to them telling them that they were a coward because I had commented on their public figure Facebook page, which you would like to think is a public page. Someone had asked me what I thought of something. And so I responded. And then this person blocked and banned me from their page. And so, so I emailed the person and called them a coward. Now, I won't say who it is, just out of privacy. I'm willing to say who it is, but probably best not to. Nevertheless, that would be a piece of advice I'd have is don't say something online you wouldn't say to someone's face. And to this person that I emailed, I would say that in that context of what transpired, I would say it to their face. So, that's important. It also prevents lying and deception and people putting out, because that happens online. I mean, big time with catfishing, right? Isn't that? I think that's a term about people that present themselves one way and they're different in real life. I've met people like that too. I'm rambling now. I apologize. Let's get to the online comments. First comment comes from the video episode from 2 weeks ago. It's a clip from, it's either the video itself or it's a clip that the team at Defenders Media produced. This comment was made on January 12th, and it is this: Jesus was political. That's the comment from, the handle is 777 with 777. Jesus was political. I think that's right. I think Jesus was political. Jesus was very political. He commented about political beliefs. He commented about political leaders. Man comes and says, here's this coin. Who does it belong to? What does Jesus say? Whose face is on it? That's a political statement. Whose face is on it? It's also a religious statement. What's implied by Jesus' comment? Well, Christians believe in the Imago Dei, that man is created in the image of God. So when Jesus says, belongs to Caesar, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, what's the implication? Give to God what belongs to God. And that's everything that we are. So Jesus was very political, which is why I sort of smiled. I let off with that comment because on the very same video, comment made last week, we have Mike Bazundhun7783 writes, "A real Christian avoids politics." Mike, I'd love to ask you what you mean by politics. I'm also interested in what you mean by a real Christian. But I don't think Christians can avoid politics in America. This is a different world than the first century that Jesus lived in. We have voting rights, for example, and the Jewish people in the first century did not. But I don't think it's possible to avoid politics. Now, I do think Christians should be wise about how we engage in partisan affairs. So Republican versus Democrat, my tribe versus your tribe. But I think it's unavoidable to not talk about what's on the news. Of course, that's not to say how we talk about things that are on the news. We don't need to give political hot takes on social media. But also, I think pastors miss part of their calling if they are quiet about the injustices that occur in our society. Christians historically have long been active in political affairs. Christians in America were the first abolitionists of slavery. We were the ones calling to get rid of the slave trade. We were the ones calling to get rid of the institution itself. If Christians were to avoid those types of injustices, the world would be very different. So we need to thank Christians for voting rights. We need to thank Christians for free speech. The Christians have made the West. So everything that we're grateful for is because of the work that Christians have done throughout the centuries. Now, if you want evidence of the claims I'm making, you've got Tom Holland's book Dominion, which is somewhere around here. And he's not even a Christian. But he points out, comparing the world of the Roman Empire to the world of the Christians, and looking at those values, how that value shift changed the course of history. It's because of the Christians. So I don't think it's true that a real Christian avoids politics. Paul himself made speeches before political leaders. He presented defenses of his belief, of his faith. Would you say he wasn't a real Christian? Mike, I think we've got to highly nuance what you're writing there. All right, let's look at Howard Deal. Howard is a longtime listener of Veracity Hill. Thank you for your comment. This comes to us from Facebook. So it's a Facebook comment from Howard. And the video was on, the video title, "Can You Have Your Name Removed from the Book of Life?" Howard writes, and it's a paragraph, it's thoughtful. Howard's commonly thoughtful on these matters. What if we look at salvation from the perspective of T.F. Torrance? There is objective reconciliation that is already achieved in Christ. All humanity is objectively reconciled and claimed in Christ. Then there is, from the subjective realization of salvation in individuals, salvation must personally participate in through the Spirit as people, and then come to share in Christ's faith, repentance, and obedience. What that means is that with objective salvation, everyone's name is in the book of life. However, at the final judgment, those who did not or refused to participate in that salvation has their names blotted from the book of life. So, according to Howard and T.F. Torrance, so salvation is not a for spiritual laws moment when your name is put into the book of life, but because you backslide or whatever you want to call it, your name gets blotted out. Now that's an interesting take. I'm trying to remember back to when I was talking about can you have your name removed from the book of life. Usually when I talk about that, it's in the context of, can someone forsake their salvation? And I think that Calvinism struggles to answer this question, particularly about these passages, that maybe God's making an empty threat about names being removed from the book of life. They seem like genuine threats by God. That's the way I interpret them. He makes a reference, I think, to Moses, and he also uses that term about blotting names out in the book of life in Revelation. I don't remember quite I don't remember the chapters and verses of those. I'm just remembering the contexts. So for someone like Torrance, according to Howard, everyone's name is in the book of life, and people's names are then removed. So that's a model there. So that's interesting. I'll have to think more about that. I'm not familiar with Torrance. I know, Howard, you are a big Torrance fan. Howard is a member of the Veracity Hill Book Club, so I get to see him a couple times each month. So thank you for sharing that model, and I'll have to think more about it and encourage others to explore the theological models that are out there. Thanks for your comment. All right, we've got two more. This next one is from Concise Cabbage, and it is from YouTube. And this was made on the 15th. Oh, and it's it comes from the video explaining Dr. J's Ordo Salutis. So this comes roughly a year ago, the models of salvation, and yes, so this comment is fresh, even though that series was last year. This comment is from this year. And Concise Cabbage writes, extremely defensible. Very nice. Would you say this probably matches what Pelagius actually taught? Great question. Concise Cabbage, that's a great question. Now the question is that we need to ask ourselves, what is it that Pelagius taught? It's not as simple as quoting Augustine on this. Why do I say that? Well, Augustine will claim Pelagianism is this, this, and this. But for those of you who read the primary texts, you would also be aware that Pelagius disputed what was accused of him. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he never believed those things. So there's Pelagianism as a doctrine, and then there's a question of what it is that Pelagius actually taught and believed. So that's a very good question, and I'd have to think back to the acronym. I think my followers had me change one of the letters. It was I'm doing a recall here. MAGCC, and the C became magic. I believe in magic. That was the fun. I had fun with that for a few weeks because it would just be weird in these Ordo Salutis conversations to say I believe in magic. Let's see. So M is man is fallen. A is atonement is sufficient for all. Grace is manifold. Then the other C was corporate election. So incorporated election makes it the magic acronym. Incorporated election, and then conditional assurance. So that's my Ordo Salutis. Was it the case that Pelagius believed those beliefs that I hold? Regarding, maybe not 100%, but perhaps on anthropology, maybe. On election, I don't see the church fathers, especially the later church fathers, holding to the priority of corporate election, or in my acronym, revised acronym, incorporated election. They are very much thinking about individuals how is an individual saved, in a common but yet different Calvinism, Arminianism type of debate. So I don't think that Pelagius would affirm the I of my magic acronym. And some of what he believed about perseverance of the saints, I don't know that we could know that. But on the relationship of free will and grace, I think there is a plausible case that he and I would agree that man's free will is the grace of God working. We don't have this either or approach. It's a both and. So there's a lot to be said there. I want to encourage anybody interested that wants to go further, check out that video. Search my YouTube channel, Explaining Dr. J's Ordo Salutis. There's a Models of Salvation playlist if you want to watch that. And I go into the acronym on what I believe of the matter there. Last comment before we finish up here comes from Art. He emailed. So hence this is a mailbag, not just an online comment, but he emailed. So mailbag, talking about book club, actually. And the Veracity Hill Book Club is currently, as I reach down and pick up this book, Perspectives on Paul, looking at 5 different views of the Apostle Paul and his beliefs. It's a lot of fun. If you want to join, it's low commitment, 2 times a month, the second and fourth Tuesday night, 7 to 8:30 p.m. We have a Google Meet that we use for those that are not in person. Some people come in person as well for a small group book discussion. Here's Art's message. And I wanted to read this because, well, it's thoughtful and it resonates with part of why we do what we do at Veracity Hill. Discussions like ours often employ theological terms, as if everyone understands and shares the same meaning and functional significance. I think a sharp focus on the definition and functional significance of each of the following terms and their connection to each other is important and would be profitable. 1. Actual righteousness. 2. Imputed righteousness. 3. Infused righteousness. 4. Righteousness in general. 5. Initial justification. 6. Final justification. 7. Justification in general. 8. Salvation. 9. Regeneration. 10. Sanctification. Particularly difficult for me in light of my legal training is the theological term, number 7, justification. In English and American criminal law, justification and a related term, excuse, have precise and clear meanings. Intentionally committing a homicide is prima facie murder, and it is murder unless the killer has a legal justification or has a legally cognizable excuse. An example of a justification is a reasonably necessary killing in self-defense of your own or a third party's innocent life or prevention of great bodily harm. In this case, no crime whatsoever has ever been committed. The prima facie case of murder is defeated. The killer has acted rightly and justly. So the use of the term by the law justification aligns with semantics and common sense. Another justification is the action of a serviceman obeying a valid order of a superior. Yet another is the action of a government official, a government officer imposing capital punishment, right? Like extracting justice. He continues, an example of an excuse is being under extreme provocation. Killing a man you stumble upon because he's having relations with your wife. A crime has still been committed, but it's manslaughter, not murder, because it was an understandable, that's Art's use, an understandable crime of passion caused by the outrageous conduct of the victim of the homicide. How does theological justification align with semantics and common sense? That is a great question. How does theological justification align with semantics and common sense? It's a great question. That's also a difficult question because we are so far removed from, say, the Apostle Paul, getting back to sort of book club topic. We're so far removed that we've lost our cultural ear what is it that Paul would think about these notions of justice? That's exactly what we're trying to do with Book Club, is read these different perspectives, these different interpretations of Paul. And so what we think today about justice in the 21st century might have shifted from what, say, the first century view of the Apostle Paul is. This is why there are books written about Paul's view of justification. And what's common sense to us may not be common sense to thinkers from the past, so we have to do that hard work. These theological debates are complex, and Art, I think you've seen that as we are working through this book in Veracity Hill Book Club. So thank you for coming to Book Club and understanding that it does take quite an effort to go deep into the weeds on these issues. This is one way I find myself growing in my spiritual walk, as I deal and grapple with the text of Scripture. You know, Howard, who I mentioned earlier, he's been a long-time listener, long-time Book Club member as well. I've really enjoyed how he talks about Book Club and that it's doing shop together. Now, talking to everybody out there, if you've ever found that you're not being spiritually fed at your church and you just want to go deeper, please consider joining us for Book Club, because these are rigorous yet understandable conversations that several of us are having 2 times a month, and I think many of us enjoy it. That's why we keep coming back to it. It's a way of talking shop with each other. It's like working out mentally. You're working out with your buddies, your friends who like to think about these deep theological subjects. So back to Art's question, how does theological justification align with semantics and common sense? That's the question we're all asking when we think about all of these terms and what these terms mean. So, no quick answer on that one, but great to see you're thinking and grappling deeply with these concepts. Okay, no haters today. So, with that does it for the show today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Patrons are people that are monthly partners with us at Veracity Hill. If you have found the material that we're producing edifying to you and to others, go ahead, look at the comments on YouTube and TikTok and Facebook. Let me know if you think we're making an impact. We're having people think deeply about these issues. Consider becoming a monthly partner with us at veracityhill.com. I'm also grateful for the partnerships with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. I want to thank our technical producer, Gabe, for all the fine work he does week in, week out for Veracity Hill, and for the rest of the team at Defenders Media, Mark, Beth, Dante, Kyle, Sophia, Kevin, Peter, and others. I commonly forget someone, but I really am grateful for everybody at Defenders Media for the work that they do for Veracity Hill and for being co-laborers in the Lord with me here. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in or for watching as we're striving for truth on Bart Ehrman's view of the resurrection of Jesus.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.